for our webinar from ERS on student-based budgeting, following up on the release of our student-based budgeting implementation guide. Thanks especially for joining us a second time around. I think we have all of our kinks ironed out, and we're really pleased to be having the discussion today. My name is David Rosenberg. I'm a manager here at ERS, and I'm sitting with Jonathan Travers, who's a partner here at ERS, and also on the line we have John Scanlon, who is the Chief Financial and Administrative Officer in Cleveland, and is going to be sharing some of his experiences with the current implementation of student-based budgeting. I'm going to do a quick confirmation that John is with us on the audio as well. I would probably have to unmute him. All right, John, I've just unmuted you. Are you with us?
I sure am. Thank you.
Super. Thank you. Okay. Let's jump in. We will have plenty of time for questions. We will have plenty of time for questions as we move into the conversation. So that's part of our slide. Yep. If anyone's confused, what you're looking at is part of our slide. When we get to questions later, or if you have anything urgent now, as we've had in the past, a couple of things, we will be monitoring the chat box. So if you want to pose a question to us or the entire group, please type it in the chat box. You also have the ability to raise your hand, and we'll be monitoring that as well. And then just check to see if you have been unmuted, which I belatedly but now have done for John. So this will become particularly relevant as we move into the conversation. So our agenda for today. First, we'd just like to share a little bit of context about the work we do here at ERS and a quick recap on student-based budgeting. John is going to share with us some of the lessons that are being learned in Cleveland, and Jonathan is going to put some of those lessons and other work we've done here at ERS around student-based budgeting in a national context. And then we should have roughly 25 or 30 minutes available for questions. Several of you have submitted questions earlier in the registration process, which we appreciate, and so we've teed up a couple of those to get the conversation rolling. So first, just a bit about ERS. We are a nonprofit organization. We're based here in Watertown, Massachusetts, and we work nationwide with urban school systems on ensuring that they can organize resources in ways that ensure that every school can succeed for every student. Our vision of how that happens is something we call System 2020, and this is a 7-part vision of school system transformation that covers, as you can see, quite a broad range of topics. The conversation today, and where a lot of the conversations start, is with funding, and obviously funding is in the way resources are distributed through a funding system has a direct impact on everything else that you see here, and so it's sort of the first of the dominoes in the process. We do work nationwide with large urban districts across the country. We also, in the last couple of years, have been very active in the state, at the state level, most recently in Tennessee, Georgia, and Michigan. And that's been a particularly exciting development for us. It's an opportunity just to see how districts in the state are intersecting more closely, and also to work with a broader range of districts within a given state, as the Georgia example in the bottom describes. Okay, so a quick recap on student-based budgeting. Hopefully by this point, folks have had a chance to at least scan through the guide to implementing student-based budgeting that we recently published. What you'll see in the next few minutes is a very quick primer on some of the key points that are described therein. Obviously, if you haven't found this yet, it is available on our website at erstrategies.org, and will be the foundation for much of our conversation today. So just a quick recap. student-based budgeting is one approach that many districts have taken to strengthen their funding system, which leads to the question of what does a strong, healthy school system funding system look like. And we tend to look at three aspects of the funding system. The first is equity. Are resources distributed equitably based on student need? And we do make a pretty big distinction between equity and equality. Doesn't mean that every school gets exactly the same resources. It means they get the resources that are appropriate for the needs of the students and the capacity of the teachers in that school. The second piece is transparency. So can people understand where and how and why the dollars flow through the system? And the third is flexibility. Can school leaders actually define the resources that they need and deploy resources in the way that are most appropriate for their school? Not every school operates in exactly the same way, even the most sort of top-down consistent school districts. Districts that adopt student-based budgeting do so with an eye towards all three of these aspects of healthy funding. So from an equity standpoint, the common phrase is that the dollars follow the student, and they also follow the student based on student need. We'll talk a little bit about that. From a transparency standpoint, there's a formula that should be reasonably straightforward for school leaders to understand. It tells you what you get. It adds some predictability into the system. And then from a flexibility standpoint, school leaders actually own their own budgets and therefore ideally have the ability to make resource decisions in the school, as I mentioned, based on the needs of the students and the adults in that school building. So one quick point here is that a rose by any other name is still a rose. We call this system student-based budgeting. As you travel around the country from district to district, you will commonly hear things like weighted student funding, fair student funding, equitable student funding. These are all the same, and the lexicon tends to reflect the priorities and focus of a given district. For our purposes, we call this student-based budgeting, or SBB, which is a pretty common version of the term. So quickly, what is it that differentiates student-based budgeting from a traditional funding system? And we look at three characteristics for our purposes here. The first is, how do schools receive funds? In a traditional model, there's typically district-wide ratios around staffing or other resources. So every school receives one guidance counselor, or every school receives one English teacher for every 50 students. Whereas in student-based budgeting, the formula starts with individual student needs, which means that two schools with different student bodies might actually end up having a different configuration of staff and other resources. The second factor is what's included in the school budget. So in a traditional school budget will include specific staff positions and then some resources that are prescribed to the school. Whereas in student-based budgeting, it's all in terms of dollars. Some of those dollars are going to be, as we'll describe, locked or standard for each school. But for the most part, districts will unlock a significant portion of those resources for the school leader to make decisions with his or her team on how to deploy them. There are some categorical or centrally controlled funds that flow through the system in student-based budgeting. And then third, and crucially, is what portion of the school budgets do school leaders actively control? In a traditional model, because so much of a school's resources are tied up in people, and the people are being assigned in a prescribed way from the district, the school leaders tend to have control over tens, maybe $100,000 or more dollars in their school budget, less than 5% of the school budget, depending on the size of the school. With student-based budgeting, you've extended control in at least some level to the school leader over at least half and sometimes close to 2/3 of the school budget. And that gives the school leader and her team a lot more flexibility to define how to deploy those resources to meet student needs. So in the guide, we talk about a whole set of key decision points, and there's one that we really want to hone in on here, which came up in several of your questions, which is, what student attributes do we weight? And the answer here is, as it is in most interesting questions, it depends. And it depends on the district and the nature of the student body that you're serving. But we do have 5 attributes of what a good weight looks like. So the weight should be relevant. That means it should actually be tied to student need. It should be measurable objectively and quantifiably, not a value judgment or a qualitative judgment. It should be independent. and I'll give you a specific example here. Schools should have direct control over the metrics. So for example, if I'm running a grade 6 through 8 school, 6th grade proficiency rates, over which I have some control because I'm educating those 6th graders, should not be part of the formula of how I receive funding for my school. 5th grade proficiency rates, however, might be more relevant as long as I am truly independent from the operation of the elementary school. The weight also should be significant. So you don't want this to be something that touches only a couple of students, but once you think about a district that, say, has 99% poverty, poverty no longer becomes a significant attribute for weighting. It doesn't differentiate need anymore in that district. And the last is it should be diversified, again, not just significant by students, but diversified across schools. And there should be variation across schools so that the differentiation in resource distribution is reflected by the needs of the schools. So last point we want to make here is that student-based budgeting is thought of commonly as an approach to funding, but the reality is that it when done well, or to do it well, requires a real rethinking of how the system works. So in a traditional budgeting model, the district will define a budget. It will assign staff out to schools with the remaining resources. And then the school says, okay, given the staff and dollars you're giving me, what do I want to accomplish next year? It's a very logical approach, but it's also a very different approach from student-based budgeting, which starts with schools and students. It basically says to each school leader, what is your vision for the school? What are your student needs? What are you trying to accomplish next year? Define your staff needs based on that, and then apply those needs in the context of a budget that largely comes in the form of dollars for you to allocate based on your school plans. And the process is iterative, right? So clearly, if my plan and my staffing plan doesn't align with the budget I receive, then there's an iterative process within my school and also going back with the finance team and the HR team to make sure my plan aligns with the budget needs. So tactically, this means two big things. One is that school leaders have a lot more strategic responsibility over the direction of the school. It changes the nature of a principal's job. Secondly, the district office is much less directive, and it assumes much more of a customer service role because the center of the strategy is coming from the school. Now, clearly, as we said, the process is iterative, and in healthy districts, you have an area superintendent or a network superintendent that is providing direct support and management to a principal through the process. So it's not as if principals operate on an island, but we have sort of flipped the traditional process on its head a bit, and that has big implications for how the district, central office, and schools interact. Student-based budgeting is just one window on system transformation that can happen in many ways. So with all that said, I want to toss the mic to John to share some of what we have learned from Cleveland. And John, I believe you are still unmuted, and the floor is yours.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Looking forward to the opportunity to share with you. I will start my comments off with a disclaimer that this conversation is probably been shaped over the last 3 weeks since we tried to do this and has probably a different flavor than it would have had 3 weeks ago, because at that point we were initiating the rollout of our SBB, and at this point we've initiated the rollout and paused it and are getting ready to re-roll it out. And I think some of the lessons learned that we'll talk about really are framed around that. So we can go ahead and step through the slides here and talk a little bit about the context, since that is a critical piece of understanding that folks need to take away about the district that is implementing. The first part of this is around what we call the Cleveland Plan here. It's a unique plan that was written by the city and the school district. It defines the goals of the district in relationship to the city. As you may or may not know, Ohio is the wild, wild west of charter school engagement out there. Basically, unlimited ability to sponsor and open charter schools. And so one of the things that we did was define our district model in a different way around the portfolio district. We are following a portfolio model based on the SERPI work that's going on. Some of the things that you saw in the ERS guide around the characteristics are things that are representative of a district that's working in the portfolio arena as well. And the reason we did that was to begin to shift the conversation from who owned the schools and why we had a district of 100 schools and another district of 100 charter, or the same district with 100 charter schools in it, to really begin to shift the conversation to one of school quality and putting the conversation in public that all schools should be quality schools, and that if they are not, they need to close despite who owns those schools. And we feel that that's going to improve our opportunities for our students by both controlling and managing the quality of the education product that is presented to our students. As a result of that definition of the Cleveland Plan, we then went to our state legislators, and House Bill 525 was created specific and solely for Cleveland. And what it did is it provided some additional work rule flexibility for the district. It was a compromise between basically saying no union rights or responsibilities, or totally where we were in a very lockdown, controlled situation with the union contract. And it blended the changes that we talked about in the Cleveland Plan, and it engaged the union in a more positive conversation, and essentially allowed us to do away with some of the key barriers that we'd seen focusing on school improvement in the past. In particular, it said that seniority or tenure would not be the sole reason for maintaining or sustaining a teacher in the system, that it was still valuable information to be used in the decisions around hiring and retention, but it was not the sole reason. We took that language from the House bill and actually renegotiated our contract with our teachers union in the last year, and again formalized some of the flexibilities that we were looking for around changes we need to make in classrooms that principals would be able to use with their budgets, and then essentially had the stage set to create our funding formula, which we worked on for the last year or so. During this time period, the CEO was pushing, because of the nature of the House bill and the Cleveland Plan, and the fact that we went to our public and asked for additional dollars in the way of a levy. He's pushing us hard to go faster and move things forward. And so we've had a clock ticking the whole time during the design period and rollout. And finally, we reached a design solution, as I said, that we rolled out about 3 weeks ago to 4 weeks ago. The next slide really does capture where we believe schools are and the districts is as far as beliefs. We believe school leaders should be in control of their time, that they control their treasure, which is obviously their students and their staff, and that it really is fundamental for them to be able to hire and make hiring decisions and sustain decisions at the school level. We believe that as a district, all leaders have these tools available, so this is not a model of earned autonomy, and we are going to use the quality conversation to really frame our schools being held accountable. So as we provide you resources and decisions around the resources, you will be held accountable for making those outcomes work for you. So what do the weights look like in Cleveland? We did establish a base weight, and one of the points that I'd like to point out is that we established a relatively low base weight that then reflected higher supplemental weights that touched on things like literacy, graduation rate, mobility, SPED, and ELL. One of the learnings that I said occurred in the last 3 weeks was that this became a public communications issue. Essentially, the state gives approximately $7,600. We set a base weight in the high threes, about $3,900. And as a result of that, even though students' weighting totals exceeded the amount that the state provides as a foundation aid to each student, people immediately grasped that base weight and said, well, clearly you're cooking the books because you're taking $7,600 in and only giving $3,900 out. And so one of the learnings I would have is just from the optic of reviewing your weights if you were moving forward is be sure that there is a clear understanding of what's involved in the total revenue that goes to your students and not just the base weight. It's more difficult, and in retrospect, it probably would have been easier trying to establish a base weight closer to our state foundation aid. But nonetheless, we did roll it out with a lower value, but we had a much heavier weight than that called in things that we were interested in principals being aware of. And those were things that our design team of principals helped us work on. Literacy, both low or underperforming and higher performing students are weighted. Graduation rate, we have a tremendous urban mobility problem here. And in addition to that, we have a new state law around the third grade guarantee, which basically says you will not advance if you're not reading at the third grade level. So we put a large number of dollars into a focus allocation for our K-3 students, really beginning to focus on that effort to ensure reading at grade level by third grade. In addition, we have base weights that cover, or building weights that are covered at the special ed and ELL students. I will tell you that we are twice the number of special ed students as most districts in the country. This is a huge driver. One of the things that principals had their eyes opened as we rolled this out 4 weeks ago was around just how many dollars really are tied up in the support of our special education students. This is one of the areas that we intend to work on as a district, both around identification and looking for ways to properly fund and support those students, because it does take up nearly 24% of our dollars that are in schools. So principals really do feel the earning impact on that. Finally, we have a formula that the district strategies are aligned to, and we want to make sure that our stakeholders are aware of the expectations for schools. Principals don't have to use those dollars on the particular emphasis areas that they're given, but they are held accountable for producing results in those areas. As I said, one of the things that we continue to learn, even before and after the rollout, is that the devil is in the details. As an example, we rolled out our first step in this process was to get principals to verify their student counts at their schools. We'd repeatedly talked to them about the fact that the student number and characteristics was a driver in their funding, and yet we had a number of principals that sent back an approved list to us that in retrospect, after editing and following up with them, we found were incorrect. We, in one case, had failed to include the right number of ELL students. The principal said, yeah, I knew it, but I didn't know that I should do anything about it. So it really is a communication issue. The devil in the detail is communicating. And the other piece of that is that it really isn't real until it becomes real at their school. And somehow you need to over-communicate and drive that impact home early on and often with every school. So let's talk about some of the transition approaches that we took to allow our schools to ease into this. And again, this slide would be changed and updated over the last 3 weeks. We did put a soft landing in that allowed schools to cap losses and gains. we, as a leadership team, communicated one thing and actually executed a second thing. We said that we were putting a cap and gain in, but another part of our issue was we were rolling this out at the same time we had slightly fewer dollars involved in the total budget due to loss of revenue from loss of students out of the district. This caused schools to see, when we told them they would have a 10% cap, that 10% cap was on their student-based budget or pupil-based allocation, but it exceeded the 10% because we also had a 4% reduction across the board for all schools. So this really created a confusion factor amongst our principals, and we have gone back since that rollout and adjusted those caps and gain losses to allow it to reflect a much lower level and truly reflect what their total losses were. We also we modeled this year on an average salary. We intend to go to actual salaries in the future, but one of the things we wanted to do was essentially blunt the union conversation around this being a selective mechanism for high-paid teachers. So we did go with average salaries. A number of principals pointed out that they would like to fairly quickly get to the actual cost because they believe that's where the leverage is. So quickly, I think principals begin to learn how to use their budgets most effectively. We did, again, calculate a baseline service measure. It was calculated initially, but I think we failed to accurately reflect the rest of the work around the portfolio district, and that is that we have a number of small schools, and the baseline was not really set accurately for our smallest schools, and that again proved to be a problem with the initial rollout as we tried to go back and adjust around small school impacts and viability of that school. Communication of clear flexibilities. We did, I think, do well in this area for the most part. We created a document that principals have that clearly outlines what flexibilities they have around hiring, decisions around use of dollars. It is fairly detailed around those flexibilities and a good working tool for them. We also set up a revision and planning cycle, which is supported by a new central office team, and principals have been going through that, making their initial inputs based on their strategic plans for their school's academic programs, and I think that has been quite successful as well. We learned quickly that you can do a lot of training with principals, but do not forget your central office. We redesigned our central office to create network support teams that handle smaller subsets of schools on a one-to-one basis, a relationship. And those schools are, I think, getting much better support both around questions of what and how they can operate in their budget and how that ties and supports to the academic plans they want to pursue. Finally, we did not pilot here. We went whole hog in and rolled everyone at once. And it's, you know, I think you have pains either way. You run a multiple system if you run a pilot program. If you're already running, a differentiated system for some of your schools, then that might not be as big a problem. But we did not want to create that problem, so we rolled everyone at once. And that means that a lot of people have been scrambling and working hard for the last few weeks and months. And it is a huge impact both on central office and principals when everyone is rolled at once. So let's talk just briefly about a few of the learning points and then wrap it up. We do have a strategy, I said, around portfolio work. It really is a strategy that is looking at driving a quality improvement by driving quality teachers into classrooms. We have a number of things that we are leveraging as part of our portfolio. We have the teacher development evaluation system, which is now a performance-based system. It's tied directly to a differentiated compensation system that allows teachers to move up and earn more compensation based on their performance, which is essentially half of their grade is through school-based observations by the administrator. The other half is a value-add testing portion of the grade that comes through the state. Those two roll up into a single grade that then is provided, or evaluation that is provided to the teacher. That then drives a point system and moves a teacher up or holds them at a current compensation level. So we are working as part of the portfolio to really drive this performance-driven culture. I will say, and in context, the other piece that you need to understand is that our workforce is unique, and I know every district says this, but we have probably the most expensive, due to seniority of any of the districts that I've had the opportunity to look at or visit. We have a curve that looks like a question mark. If you laid it down with the dot on the question mark on the axis, the XY axis, we have a huge curve that is shifted well right, and a large percentage of our teachers are in that 20 to 30 year band, and by large I mean in excess of 40%. So we are really a very senior workforce. So part of our strategy also is beginning to use the transition and retirements that we see to help us shape and become more flexible in our budget as well. Integration and interdependency issues are paramount. I saw this with our work. By that, I'm simply saying that the portfolio work, everything else that we are doing has suddenly been highlighted in the budget process and integrated to the budget process. Whether it's work around selecting, hiring teachers, whether it's work around curriculum, work around the number of schools we have, the size of the schools, opening a new school, all of those things have suddenly taken new meaning to people when they see the impacts in the school budgets. And in particular, I would say that this interdependency issue has raised a number of political issues. You can go into this with the blinders on, believing it's a budget issue, but you will, I think, clearly come quickly to the realization that this has everything to do with change management, and the political lens, and whether it's your union, your city council, your public, or the teachers in your schools, it is a very, very difficult change that needs to be managed. It's not simply changing a spreadsheet and the way we do business in the financial department. We trained a tremendous amount with our principals. We learned quickly that we hadn't trained our central office, so we did begin to go back and rework that. So that was a learning point. We also saw that training has to be repeated. It has to be just in time. And no matter what, if you're giving somebody training but they're not seeing the impact in their everyday job, it just doesn't register with them. And so until we rolled out the budget and people saw that they were going to have to make tough decisions around that budget, it wasn't clear what was going on there. I would extend that trains line to include your community, your central office, and your teachers. Everyone needs to understand the what, why, and how of what's going on with your budget. Again, there's always a tendency with student-based budgeting to have special cases. Are you in or out? We immediately had to tackle that, and I don't know that we did it eloquently or correctly, but we did get into a situation where we do have some new school designs underway. Those were essentially held out or held harmless from the rollout and are standing alone until they become fully functional. So as they grow out their student population, they will grow into SBB, was our solution. And finally, as I said, the last bullet I've already mentioned is that this really is about change. We've got change going on everywhere in this district, from, again, declining student populations to new school designs being introduced and implemented. all of that change makes it very uncomfortable for people, and I think you just need to be well aware of that as you work through your processes. Finally, I'll wrap it up with some of the things I think we did do well. I told you we created the network support teams, integrated teams of both HR, finance, special needs, legal, and other specialty areas that support schools, and create a relationship with those schools. Not unique, but I think for Cleveland, it was a transition to a new way of doing business, and it is proving very, very successful, both in breaking down the stovepipes within the central office and also providing a new level of support to schools. We created a good guidebook, ran some, I think, some quality seminars for training. I think I would prefer to do more seminar-type work in the future and less sit and get that we did with large bodies. We created a toolkit of resources for our principals and provided that both in a hard copy and online format. We really worked hard to not frame this as a budget driver, but to frame this around academic drivers, and ERS helped us really focus around school design as the principal, and from that school design then is smart strategic use of resources to support that school design. I think that's been very successful and offers great opportunities for us in the future as we move forward. And as part of that work, we were able to create a number of models of what smart designs might look like. How do you use your time flexibly? How do you use student groupings in different ways? And all of those models, I think, are also helpful in designing the strategic move in the academic arena, and then pulling in the how do we resource question as secondary, as opposed to allowing resources driving the academic solution. So with that, I will go silent and turn it back over to Jonathan.
Thanks, John. This is Jonathan Travers from ERS. I do want to get into the questions and discussion, but I think it's worth taking a minute or two to reflect on a lot of the same themes that John just shared from Cleveland in more of a broader national context. So, if someone were to say to me, "Hey, we're headed down this SBB path. What advice do you have for me?" These are the seven takeaways that I'm going to go through that I think would be most important to start with. So first is it's about academics and not finance, actually. So yes, this conversation is grounded in the school funding portion of the ERS 7 transformational strategies framework. That said, if we don't expect our schools to organize their resources differently, to reconfigure how they're meeting the needs of their students, to fundamentally around academics, then we're not doing the right thing. So we really think that this is about academics first, and that finance is really the means to an academic end. John talked specifically about how closely connected SBB implementation was to their overall theory of action as a district, this overall portfolio strategy. I think that's really important to think about SBB in the context of your broader theory of action, your broader vision for how you want to transform student performance in your system. So if you are down a managed performance empowerment path, if you're down an empowerment path, a portfolio, it seems hard to imagine that you're going to get there without doing some kind of SBB kind of approach. If conversely, you want all of your schools to look exactly the same and you believe that their needs are exactly the same because you're trying to run a managed instruction theory of action, then I'd say that SBB is it would be a strange thing to invest lots of energy in. Second, I'd say, make it worth your while or don't make it. John, we talked earlier about the percent of the total dollars that are running through the formula that play out in schools. In Cleveland, we've ended up, I think, somewhere close to 70% of total school dollars that are in the formula. 40% of total district spending is running through the formula. Those, to me, feel like very strong percentages, that schools do now have meaningful flexibility. If you're just going to monetize, the allocations that are equivalent to the principal, a school secretary, and the custodial staff in the school, but you're going to hold tight on teachers and all special ed and so on, you're not really going to provide meaningful flexibility, and it's unreasonable to think that schools are going to make meaningful redesigns with the flexibility that you're giving them. So, go big or go home, make it worth your while, or don't make it, I think would be the second piece of advice. John gave you lots of examples of why details matter a lot. I'd say that if you can get the allocations right for 90% of your schools, in some contexts, that's an A-. That's not acceptable here. You've got to make this work for every school within the total dollars that you have available for the district. And there's so many ways in which the details of design and implementation affect that, whether it's the loss limit that John mentioned, whether that's having super clarity on what activities and stuff that principals have to budget with their allocation versus what is going to continue to be provided to them centrally. All of those details end up being incredibly important to pull this first-year implementation off effectively. Fourth, and I think actually Cleveland has done a really nice job of this year, is we've moved Central's cheese a lot here. And in fact, the role reversal for Central is pretty staggering. So they are going largely from making the decisions about what kinds of resources and how much resources are going to go into each school to being actually the customer service support around those decisions. So the schools now have those decisions on how to configure their resources. And so Central has to shift to being customer support. And really, if they're being really good about it, they need to become advisors and consultants to help principals solve design problems, not to prescribe the sort of the central solution that that they would have previously done in the past. Next piece, ground design and stakeholder engagement in the why. So it's really important as we're doing all of this that we're not letting go of why we're doing it. Boston Public Schools, when they implemented this a couple years ago, I thought did a really lovely job of starting with these guiding principles for design and making sure that all of their decision-making, the design team encountered, okay, what do we want to weight and why, what should be in the formula and why, what's the policy on average versus actual teacher salary. All of those questions, design questions, came from this very specific set of guiding principles that were fundamentally about why are we doing this. And then the same thing with stakeholder engagement. So we've got to be clear if we're changing school allocations, if school principals are getting flexibility that they didn't have previously, that external stakeholders are clear how these new policies, these new actions reflect a broader improvement strategy going on in the district. So yes, so if we are rolling out SBB in the same year that we are experiencing a significant revenue decline, whether that's because we just have less revenue in the system or whether that's because there's a significant enrollment decline accompanying this, we've got an extra special challenge. And I was reflecting with a colleague who was part of the SBB rollout in Chicago on this earlier, and she was saying that they actually did, she thought, a really good job of saying, hey, in this upcoming year, we've got a significant revenue decline issue that we've got to take on. SBB is also happening, but SBB doesn't dictate how much dollars goes to schools in total. It just dictates how it's distributed across schools. And even with all of that messaging, she found it in Chicago really hard for folks to separate implementation of SBB from the overall financial picture for the district. So I think proactive communication here is really important. Even with that, you've got an extra special challenge. And then the last bit is the work is never done. So every year, you want to be able to look back at the weights, look back at what's in the formula, what's not, specific policies on loss limits, on year to year, on what you're considering to be your baseline, the minimum funding you need in all schools. You need all that, you need to reflect on that each year. And each year's worth of implementation is more and better data on what you need to do moving forward. I think Denver implemented this now 7 or 8 years ago. I think they've done a really thoughtful job each year of looking back at the decisions principals have made with the allocations, thinking about what's not in the formula, what could be, thinking about weights, and have made a series of adjustments, really year by year. You can sort of watch it, how it's been documented out, as they just continue to tweak and refine what they think is ultimately in the best interests of the entire school system. So I want to pause there with sort of with some national pieces, and then switch it over to some questions and discussion. As David alluded to before, we had a couple questions that we got in advance, 3 in fact, that we wanted to just start with, and then see what kind of discussion emerged from that in the time that we've got remaining. So just a quick process question, David, just go back to that process question on how to ask a question. If we're at all unclear, you can raise your hand. You can post a question. When we see you, we have to come in and unmute you, and that's how we can sort of call on you and keep this moving. So should we jump into our first question here? And so the first question is, how do you account for student risk factors in SBB? I think we talked about that, and John, let me come back to you on this and how we, sort of the Cleveland experience. I think you showed a little bit on it directly. But I think the idea that we're driving at with SBB is, as student needs, as different indicators related to risk of graduation, or risk of dropout, risk of failure, as those are different across different students, across different schools, we want to be able to differentiate funding to schools relative to those different needs. And so if we can identify what those risk factors are, we can give those risk factors certain weights, and then we can use those weights then to push dollars differently across schools. One interesting design question, if you're thinking about going down this path, is how do you figure out what is the right weight for each risk factor? Part of it can be deductive. So part of it can say, well, we're spending X dollars extra on services centrally for English language learner students right now. So we're going to do some weightings that work backward from that total investment to make sure that we're distributing that total investment equitably across schools with English language learner students. The other way to think about it is actually more bottoms up, is to say, well, what is the service delivery that we think that kids with this risk factor or with this need want, or that we need to provide, and then what is the cost, and therefore what is the relative weight associated with that need factor. John, do you want to add to that from the Cleveland perspective?
Yeah, the only thing that I would say is that I think we need to have, you need to have clarity with both your principals and schools and community that this is an allocation, a resource allocation model, and you essentially derive it saying that, we're going to give you additional resources, but in Cleveland's case, we're saying you do not have to apply those resources to that student subgroup, and you do not have to use it in the way we calculate it. So if we say a reading intervention specialist costs $50,000, and you're going to get that for every 15 students reading below grade level, the principal has every right to take that money and spend it in any way that they choose, not necessarily procuring a reading specialist. And that's difficult for folks because they say you're weighting the importance or the risk, and yet schools may have a decision to make that is different, and we believe that is important, that a school be able to make a different solution set based on their students' needs.
Thanks, John. Samantha, I'm going to unmute you for a moment. You had 2 questions that are related to this topic, so let's get this going. You should be able to talk to us now.
Hi, I'm not sure if can you hear me?
We can.
Excellent. So I had a question about thinking around early childhood and not just preschool, but preschool K-1, 2, and the differentiation in costs of of grade levels. So if you think about grade levels costing different amounts per child, generally our general state aid in Illinois at least thinks about it as K through 12, but thinking about differentiation of costs and how you can work that into student-based budgeting. And on that note, both in the cost but also the enrollment, if you have an increasing enrollment, which we often see in Chicago of kindergarten, an increasing enrollment in kindergarten K1, 2, whereas we may have had smaller class sizes in 4th, 5th, 6th. How you account for those two things?
Yep. So I think, Samantha, there's two parts to the question that we're hearing from you. In terms of the dollars, so using your early childhood or early elementary example, I think you've got a couple of options as a district. One, I'm gonna mute you back, by the way, so we don't have any echo on the phone. Thanks. One option that you have is to actually provide additional funds in the form of a weight for early elementary or early childhood education, if the district feels that is a place that is worth the additional investment and sort of complies with meets the values and the vision of the district. The other aspect, though, is it really depends on how much flexibility you want to give a school leader over making that investment. So it may be that you want to tell all elementary school leaders, look, you're getting more money specifically for early childhood or early elementary, and that's reflected in the formula. Or you may say, here are all of your dollars for your pre-K through 5 school. Your call on what makes the most sense for your school, and giving them flexibility. On the enrollment piece, it's a really interesting question. And what we tend to do is look at enrollment projections, not just at a district or a school level, but by grade. And that becomes a driver of how dollars get allocated. So if I'm projecting that your enrollment is increasing, then that should be built into the budgeting for the following year, specific to a given grade level.
Yeah, David, just to build on that point for a second, if you are going to weight a specific student characteristic, you also then need to project its enrollment. So if you're saying, yes, we want to have a weighting for K1, and then we want a different weighting for grades 2 and 3, then you obviously have to be able to, by school, project how many of kids that are going to get that weight are going to be in that school come the beginning of the school year.
One thing we do talk about in this, by the way, is sort of the Einsteinism of you want things to be as simple as possible and no simpler. So at some point, we see systems that where the number of weights and the number of factors that come into the formula reduce the transparency of the system. So this really is about making sort of the judicious choices about where the investments make the most sense. We also talk about how the pie is the pie, and so the more you cut into it with different weights, the less will be available for general distribution.
Yeah, as was what John was saying in Cleveland.
Yeah. Thanks for the question. We had a second question earlier around what impact SVB has on financial reporting.
So sure, I'm happy to kick this one off, and John, jump in if you want to add to it. From a sort of accounting and end of the expenditure perspective, I don't know necessarily that it inherently does. So your expenditures and the account structures that you use for your expenditures are going to be whatever you have them in. I don't know that it changes that per se. I think the place where I see on a financial reporting, from a financial reporting perspective, things changing is much more, frankly, related to budgeting and forecasting. So if you're thinking about building your budget book out for building your budget book as you're moving through your budget development process, there will be, previously in a staffing ratio-based structure, you could set the budgets. You could budget at the school level for teachers, custodians, principals, supplies, materials, and so on at the beginning of the budget process. And so those account segments would be all set, teed up, and so on. Here in SVB, you have a middle step, essentially, from a reporting perspective. You've got a moment where you've run a total allocation for the school, but you don't yet know what accounts what accounts those dollars are ultimately going to end up in. And it's over the course of the school's decision-making process, whether that's 4, 6, 8 weeks, so they've got to figure all this out, that becomes clear. And ultimately, what you load into your financial system for school budgets is going to be what comes at the end of that process, where you've got all of the objects figured out, the functions, the whole account structure laid out. So extra step on the front end on the budgeting side.
I would just say from
John, do you want to add?
Go ahead, John.
Yeah, I'd just say from the Cleveland perspective that I think one of the things we've seen at the state level is a real push around not only your financial reporting, but an effectiveness of that financial reporting. So what are you getting the public for those dollars? And I think this work is positioning us much better to be able to begin to have return on investment type of conversations around how we are spending those dollars. It doesn't really, I concur, it doesn't really change our reporting out, but I think it does offer opportunities as we move forward to really change the level of engagement across the district about how we spend our dollars and the effectiveness of that. And the other thing, going back to that previous question about grades and grade levels, I would just say if you've got a number, even a small number of small schools, think it through, play it out, because small schools, as we are quickly learning, is a huge driver. If you've got one first grade teacher and one second grade teacher and classes are 10 or 12 or 15 or 40, there's not a lot of flexibility there. You either got to add a teacher or take a teacher away and create a blended class looping or something. And it is a difficult proposition around small schools. So just be aware of that as a key driver as well.
I don't see other hands raised. We have a couple minutes left, and I want to jump us to our last question that we received in advance of the conversation. What is the impact on student achievement? And I think the way to think about that is sort of as the impact of student-based budgeting should be on the health of your funding system, and a healthy funding system that enables resource decisions at the school level that, because the school leader has flexibility over resources, we know from research that that factor of being able to make smart resource decisions at a school level does have an impact on potential student achievement. And so I would view student-based budgeting as a potential input that creates conditions whereby you can empower school leaders with tools to have a greater impact on student achievement. I think it would probably be flawed to say, as it is with almost anything in this field, that any single factor is going to have the big driver, but this really is about creating conditions for success. I would say, Jonathan or John, would you add anything?
Yeah, that makes sense. I think if we look at the dozen or so urban districts across the country that are doing SBB and tried to run a regression relative to all others, I think we'd have a tough time coming up with SBB being the statistically significant. I think some of the districts that have done this as part of a broader improvement strategy, and I'd say New York City, Denver, Baltimore stick out in my mind as places that SBB is part of the whole strategy. Those three have had significant improvement over the course of the time of implementation. Now, can I say it is because of SBB? I'd say no, it's because of the strategy of which SBB is a part.
I just say finally, it's a great forcing function for that academic conversation. When you see your principals sitting down having conversations about both the needs and capabilities of their students, the capacity of their staff, and then how to design an academic solution and then resource it, it really does change the dynamics of what's going on in your individual schools.
We are at our hour. We appreciate the questions and your participation and listening, and also your willingness to come back and join us for the conversation. As you mentioned, the Student-Based Budgeting Implementation Guide is available on our website, which is erstrategies.org. You can also look there using the search, or you can also look on LinkedIn for a group we've set up called Fair Student Funding, where more conversation can continue. So thank you so much for joining us, and we'll look for this to be posted on our site, and be in touch anytime. Take care.